Part 4, Value. We now turn to look at ethics. So, what is ethics? Well, some people split morality and ethics and take them to be separate things. Others smush them together. But here we go. So morality, roughly put, is this. It's the customs, precepts, and practices that deal with good and bad, wrong and right. Now, morality can be broken down into many types of or levels of ethics. As we saw before, back in the ancient day of part 1, the introduction to philosophy, we saw the descriptive morality, which is, as the name implies, a description of an actual morality. It simply states the moral views of a particular people at a particular time at a particular place. So if we were talking about, say, the moral views of 17th century French aristocrats, that would be descriptive ethics. Or if we were talking about the view of the American upper class regarding the ethics of the use of police violence, also descriptive ethics. Now, what if we want to get beyond descriptive ethics? Now, there's nothing wrong with descriptive ethics, of course, but doing that is doing sociology, anthropology, history, etc. But when you do the philosophy stuff, we head into different levels of abstraction in ethics. At the most abstract level, there's what's called meta-ethics. And this involves creating and assessing moral theories, dealing with the most abstract level. So a question like, what is goodness? Not like what is good, but what is goodness itself? Is it something that's a feature of reality, kind of like in movies and books and stuff where there's good and evil, real powers? Or is it just how we kind of feel about stuff? And we just say, hey, that's good when we like it, and say, hey, that's bad when we dislike it. Moving closer to Earth, we have normative ethics, which involves creating and applying moral standards. So, for example, a philosopher, might develop a set of standards regarding the use of, the ethical use of violence, say in a protest, and, work out a theory of that. And we have people who have done that. Good example would be the theories of civil disobedience developed by Thoreau, Gandhi, and Dr. King. And those would be normative ethics. How do you engage in protest? Then there's, at the most concrete level, applied ethics, which involves, not surprisingly, applying these moral standards to particular cases and situations. So if someone was operating from a moral theory regarding protesting and the use of violence or not use of violence, and they were actually, applying it, either, writing a blog post about it or actually doing it for real, that would be applied ethics, acting upon it. So if someone refuses to engage in violence in a protest because of their belief in civil disobedience, that would be applied ethics. If someone believes that the use of violence can be justified in protests and then engages in violence, also applied ethics. Now, as a branch of philosophy, moral philosophy / ethics involves rationally and systematically attempting to understand these moral terms, statements, principles, theories, analyzing all this stuff, creating all this stuff, applying all that stuff. Now, there's many moral problems and questions, some very abstract, like, is morality objective or subjective? What is the foundation of morality? Could it be God? Is there a metaphysical goodness, as Plato claimed? Is it just how we feel about stuff? And then, of course, there are more particular questions in ethics, like, is stem cell research morally acceptable? Do people have a moral obligation during a pandemic, like the one we're in now, to engage in social distancing? Or do they have the right to just act in accord with what they want to do, refuse to accept social distancing? Is it acceptable to use violence in protest? What are the moral limits of the police use of force? And these would all be moral questions and problems. Ethical assessment and value. Moral theories are often defined in terms of the main focus they take for moral assessment. And these include actions to assess, what is done. Are these actions right or wrong? Are they obligatory, optional, neutral, etc.? Secondly, consequences. These would be the outcomes, the fruit the reaping of the sowing of the actions. Also character. What sort of person is it? Virtuous, vicious, neutral? And then, of course, a person's motives. Why are they doing what they're doing? And as I noted, moral theories tend to pick one and fixate on it. For example, when you look at our good dead friend Immanuel Kant, he's very focused on the ethics of actions, that an action itself is good or bad regardless of its consequences. But he does consider character and motives. Our good dead friend John Stuart Mill focuses on consequences. The actions themselves only matter in terms of the consequences, and when assessing the ethics of actions, the character and motives are not particularly important. Now, in kind of normal everyday life, when we're assessing people, we tend to factor all four of these. What did the person do? What were the consequences? What kind of person are they? And why did they do it? Now, in some cases, all these line up. They could all be good. For example, imagine someone who gives other people, who are unemployed because of the pandemic, provides them, gives them some food and gift cards and some money. And this is a good thing to do, good action, typically. Consequences, it helps the people are helped. They're able to keep eating so they don't, starve. And if the person's doing it because they're virtuous, they're a kind and generous person, that's good. And if their motivation is generosity, that would be good. It would be good all across the board. And of course, there can be things that are evil across the board. For example, a person could kill someone, and killing is generally seen as bad. It can have awful consequences to obviously the person being killed, their family, etc. And the person could do so out of bad character. They could be a, say, violent, racist person, and their motives could be terrible. Just, they could be driven by anger and hatred and racism, etc. And so it could be all bad. Now, there can be cases where these mix and match a bit, where there are some good and some bad. For example, a person could have bad character and bad motives, but do good things. So if you have someone, for example, who's very driven by just, their pride, they want people to think well of them, and they're driven because they want to, say, get power and influence. But they do, nice things. So, for example, you can imagine someone helping other people out during the pandemic, and these have good consequences, but the person's doing it not out of kindness or generosity, but to gain influence, to seem good. Perhaps they have intentions to run for office later, or they want to, make money. They want to sell stuff. And so bad character, bad motives, but doing good stuff. And of course, you can have people of good character and good motives do actions that end up having, terrible consequences. This often is, kind of a plot for many sci-fi horror movies where somebody or a scientist has really good motives. They're trying to make some cure or, for disease, or make something to help people live longer. And then it gets out into the population and it turns them into vampire monsters or zombies or something. And in real life, the same thing can happen. They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and out of good character and good motives, people can sometimes do awful things. So how do we keep score? So scorekeeping in ethics works in terms of value. Now, put neutrally, value is a measure of worth, and this can include moral worth and, of course, things that are non-moral. One obvious example, of course, would be economic or monetary value, and we measure that in terms of, in the United States, in terms of dollars. There's also things that have political value. So we don't really have we don't have an exact currency for that. We don't have political points or influence bucks. But the idea is that we can talk about certain political speeches, certain gaffes, misstatements, and tweets that have, say, positive or negative value for a candidate or a party. There's also things that have military value, etc. And so there's all kinds of ways to measure things. Beauty and ugliness also measures of value. Now, our focus in ethics, of course, is on moral value, good and evil, which takes us into positive and negative value. Clearly, some things have positive worth, and some things have negative worth, or, loss. In economics, we would talk about if you're running a business with positive value, you'd be making a profit. If you're losing money, negative value. If we're talking about a politician's, political, status, if they do something that helps them, we'd say that has positive value. If they do something that hurts them, we would say that has negative value. Now, value also splits into something more complicated, namely the extrinsic versus intrinsic. Now, in other fields, they speak of extrinsic and intrinsic a bit differently. So, for example, they often talk about intrinsic value meaning something that's valuable, and it's valuable like, gold or other stuff. But in philosophy, we use the terms in the following way. But again, always in philosophy, things can always be debated. So this is common use, but could be argued. So, kind of strictly speaking, something with extrinsic value means that it derives its value from something else. The value is external. These are typically things that are a means to an end. For example, you might be taking this class in order to get a grade, fulfill a genetic requirement, to graduate, to get a job, to make money, then those would all be means to an end. All of that would have extrinsic value. It can also be something useful, such as money, medicine, clothing. And these are all things that have value because we value them. And so their worth comes from us. And pretty much everyone accepts extrinsic value. The things have worth because we value them. That's pretty non-controversial. So things like money, gold, land, cars, fame, fortune, power, all means to an end. Now, somewhat more controversial is intrinsic value. And this is something that's valuable in and of itself. Now, you can take this in varying levels of, extremeness. At kind of the most extreme, something with intrinsic value would be valuable in and of itself, an end in itself, and it would be valuable regardless of how we felt or thought about it. And if we didn't value it in accord with its value, we would be wrong. To use an analogy, think of, you can think of extrinsic value as like the flavor of something. It's tasty or not tasty depending on, whether you like it or dislike it. So a particular food has extrinsic value based on the taste. But the calories that the food has or its nutrients, you could say by analogy, they're intrinsic. They're part of the food itself, and you could be right or wrong about that. So if food has like so many calories per gram, that's inherent to the food. And the person, if they deny that, they're just wrong. In the case of intrinsic value, something would just be valuable in and of itself. It would have worth, and again, pushed to like on one of the extremes, its value does not depend at all on us. And if it's not valued, the person not valuing it would be wrong. They'd be making a mistake. So what things have intrinsic value, worth in and of themselves, valuable because of themselves? Well, one thing we often say is people. We often talk about people having worth as people and not being mere things or objects. Sometimes we consider emotions like love to have worth, or people who are religious look at their love of God as having intrinsic value. They don't love God because of a means to an end, like to get heaven and avoid hell. They love God because God is worthy of love. In fact, some people argue he requires. He is such that he deserves that love. So that's the notion of value. So key concepts here: value itself, measure of worth, positive or negative, kind of self-explanatory, extrinsic, intrinsic. The extrinsic is valuable as a means to an end, valuable because it's valued, and intrinsic is valuable in and of itself. It should be valued because it is valuable. The spectrum of morality. Now, all moral views, moral theories, moral opinions can be placed on a spectrum ranging from absolutism to nihilism. And every moral view, as far as you know, fits somewhere within there, plus the side of skepticism, as we'll see in a bit. So what if you're an absolutist about morality? Well, if you're an absolutist about morality, you would accept the following as true. First, you would believe that for every moral problem, there's one and only one correct solution. You would also accept that morality is objective. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you make a moral statement about good and evil, right and wrong, these statements are true or false independently of what people think or believe about them. To use an analogy, to see morality as objective is to see it being rather like weight or mass or volume, that it is describing real features of the world. So if someone thinks that something weighs 5 pounds and it really weighs 10, they're wrong. If you're objective about morality and something really is evil and someone thinks it's good, they're wrong. So morality is objective on this view. Now, what about the absolutism part? Well, here's where the absolutism comes in. Being absolute, if you're an absolutist, you would accept that no moral principles can override any others. They're all absolute. No exceptions are permitted. For example, if lying is wrong, it's always wrong to lie, no matter what. Now, the appeal of absolutism is, well, it's absolutism. There's no gray. There's no, muddling about with like, well, sometimes this is good and sometimes that's good and sometimes this is bad and sometimes it's, that's bad. It's just absolutely, this is bad, this is always bad, no matter what, no exceptions. And that can be quite appealing because it makes reality nicely split into objective morality with absolute answers. But it's also, as people sometimes say, what to some is a feature is a bug to others. Because, to use an example, think about, lying. Yeah, we generally agree, most of us, that lying is wrong. But we can easily come up with scenarios where we would say, well, yeah, lying is wrong, but here it'd be okay to lie. And the usual historical examples involve like some sort of, fascist or evil state where, imagine you're hiding some people, whichever people are currently considered, the enemies of the state and who are being unjustly oppressed and mistreated, and you're hiding some of these people to keep them from being murdered, as governments so often want to do. And the stormtroopers of this particular, government come up and knock at your door and say, do you have any of these people here? Now, if you say yes, then they take them away and murder them, and that would be wrong. And so the right thing to do would seem to be to lie to them and say, no, of course not. I would never have such people here. I'm a good citizen of this, of this state. I'm completely behind killing all these people. And the thing to do, of course, is lie. And so intuitively, we often think that lying can be okay. So what if you want to keep the objectivity, but want to lose the absolutism? That you think there are exceptions for things like perhaps lying, or even things like the use of violence. Well, the moral theory approach for you would be objectivism. Not the Ayn Rand theory, not that, but the general moral approach of objectivism. If you're an objectivist about ethics, you would accept, kind of obviously, that morality is objective. Right and wrong, good and bad are, objectively correct, regardless of how we think or feel about them. But the objectivist allows for exceptions. So moral principles can override each other. So going to the lying example, lying can be generally wrong, but our obligations to save an innocent person's life could override that. Or violence might generally be wrong, but there could be situations where that would be overridden by another principle, perhaps to save someone's life, or perhaps in the face of an oppressive state that is abusive and only responds to violent resistance, like during the American Revolution, to use that example. Now, one of the weak points of objectivism is that when you talk to people, around the world in the 7 seas, or just right next to you, well, at a social distance, of course, the time this video is being made, you need to keep that distance, and you ask them about, good and evil, right or wrong, people are going to tend to have a lot of very different opinions, which leads people often to think, well, morality seems to depend on where people are brought up. depends on their culture. And so what if you think morality can't be objective? It all depends on where you're from and what time you live in. And people often say, back then people, they were like this, but those were those times. When they're talking about, like when someone who's older, like who does a gaffe, like Joe Biden, for example, people often defend him by saying, well, he's from a different time, things were different then. So what do we say about that? Well, you can embrace what's called moral relativism or ethical relativism. That's a view that morality is relative to or depends on the culture. So the truth of a moral claim depends on the culture in which it is made. So you probably heard the expression, when in Rome, do as the Romans. This would be the view that when in Rome, the Romans are right because it's Rome. And this does have some appeal, that morality depends on the culture. If you look at cultures, they all tend to differ. And so it's, appealing to take this view. Some people even say that it's a tolerant view. You should not say that you're right and other people are wrong. You should say everybody's right. The only problem with that is it kind of short circuits itself. Because if you accept tolerance, that means you have to accept that intolerance is wrong. So one of the ironies of the relativist argument for tolerance is it's self-defeating. Now, what if you look at relativism and say, but if I look around, the continents and the seven seas and even next door, I see everyone has very differing moralities, not just across, cultures, but across individuals. And morality is just, a matter of personal view. Well, in that case, you'd want to embrace what's called subjectivism. And some people accept it because it becomes really hard to define a culture, because you can always have subdivisions. Like, for example, look at the United States. You could talk about American culture, but then we have various subcultures that have very differing views. And you can keep narrowing the culture down to one person. So there are some reasons to embrace subjectivism, which is a view that morality depends on the individual. So morality is subjective, and the truth of moral statements depends on who made it. To kind of illustrate the distinction between relativism and subjectivism, think of the following analogy. Relativism about ethics is kind of like law. The law is what it is where you happen to be. And so, to use an example, suppose there's a state that allows fireworks to be purchased legally, or allows marijuana to be purchased legally. And someone's, driving in that state, and they stop off and, buy some marijuana and fireworks, and they drive away with them. They're driving perfectly legally. They're committing no crimes. But they drive across the border to the state next door, and in that state, fireworks and marijuana are still illegal. They are now criminals, even though nothing about them, their car, their marijuana, their fireworks has changed. They're in a different legal area. So relativism is kind of like the law. It all depends on where you are. Now, subjectivism makes morality into like your taste in food. Some people really like, let's say, pancakes. Other people, shockingly enough, don't like pancakes. But they're not wrong because you like what you like. And I have this theory that everyone has like at least one weird food combination they really like. But none of us know it's weird until someone else who doesn't think it's cool sees us eating it. And then they're like, God, that's so weird. But to us, it tastes fine. So subjectivism makes morality into taste. You like what you like, and no one's, in a way, right, no one's wrong. And one appeal of it is, I guess, everybody's right. But this leads to kind of an obvious self-destruction, which is this. If everyone's right and no one's wrong, morality amounts to nothing, because there is no, in effect, there is no morality. It's all just however you kind of feel about stuff. And so critics say that subjectivism collapses into what's called moral nihilism. Now, if you're a moral nihilist, you need not be a bad person. Like people often say they're moral nihilists, like they're bad people. But you don't have to be a bad person when you're a moral nihilist. Why? Well, because if you're a moral nihilist, you disbelieve that there is no morality. that morality is a deception or illusion. So, if you're a moral nihilist, all moral statements for you would be untrue. They would be false. Now, moral nihilists don't deny that people talk about morality. They don't deny that people have, written books on ethics. They don't deny their moral classes. What they deny is that they say there's nothing behind those words. We're talking about nothing. To use an analogy, a moral nihilist is to ethics what atheists are to religion. Atheists don't say there's no religion. They don't say there's no Bible. They don't say there's no church. They don't say there's no synagogue. They don't say there's no mosque. They don't say there's no religious writings. They just say that all that stuff is about nothing. When people talk about God, they're talking about nothing. So the moral nihilist says when people talk about morality, they're talking about nothing. Now, a moral nihilist, again, need not be a bad person, because a person can say there's no morality, and they might be, an awful person, but they can also be pretty nice. In fact, one of the nicest people I knew, one of the professors in grad school back when I was a grad student, was a moral nihilist. And he would always get very, not really upset. He'd say, I'm not a good person, because he was a moral nihilist, but super, super nice. And everyone thought he was a good person, because anybody who's not a moral nihilist would say, yes, he was. Now, what if you look at all this and say, gosh, I don't know. All this absolutism, objectivism, relativism, subjectivism, nihilism, what could the truth be? Well, if that's your view, then there's a view for you. It's called moral skepticism. It's a view that the truths of moral claims, you can't know them. And if you think you can't know, good option. So that's the dreaded spectrum of morality.